A pilot made a series of shocking mistakes that I'm sure he instantly regretted when he crashed into a power line tower. But the truth is, this wasn't the first plane crash he was responsible for, and the craziest part was what he said after the crash. That's why I'm going to share with you the entire story about what really happened and the shocking mistakes that were made. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on November 27, 2022, when a pilot and his girlfriend were making a routine flight from White Plains, New York, back to the Montgomery County Airpark in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Patrick was 66 years old and he was the pilot flying the plane. He had a private pilot certificate with an instrument rating, and according to the investigation, he had almost 1,500 hours of total flight time, with at least 500 hours in the make and model of aircraft he was flying when he crashed. Additionally, he completed an instrument proficiency check in February of 2022, about 9 months prior to the crash. However, when it comes to his actual instrument experience, the NTSB reported that his logbook didn't include a running total, but his entries during the prior year suggested he had about 16 hours of actual instrument flight experience and just over 5 hours of simulated instrument time. And one of the shocking discoveries investigators made was that this wasn't the first time Patrick was involved in a plane crash. On August 4, 1992, he was flying a Piper PA-32 with his family on board when he elected to turn into a box canyon, thinking that his rate of climb would assure clearance of the ridge at the end of the canyon. However, an area of downdrafts reduced the rate of climb to an extent that wouldn't allow the aircraft to outclimb the rising terrain, and because he thought that he didn't have enough room to turn around, he continued up the canyon and flew the aircraft through a controlled impact. Now, at the time of the crash, he was only 36 years old and he had about 500 hours of flight time, but only about 32 hours in the Piper PA-32. And thankfully, everyone on board survived because this could have turned out much worse. And honestly, aside from the fact that he never should have tried to fly up the canyon, I actually thought he made a good decision by not trying to turn around. That's because what often happens in these situations is that by the time the pilot realizes they need to turn around, it's too late. And then when they try to make that turn, they're usually going too slow, and then they pull back on the controls because the canyon is too narrow, and they stall and crash, typically killing everyone on board. However, in Patrick's case, because he continued ahead, he was able to pick out a spot in front of him that looked survivable, and he kept flying the aircraft all the way through the impact, and that's probably the only reason why he and his family managed to live. He ended up taking a few years off from flying after that, but eventually he got back in the cockpit, and now that you know a little bit more about Patrick, it's time to talk about his second crash. On the morning of November 7, 2022, 30 years after his first plane crash, Patrick and his girlfriend showed up at the Montgomery County Airpark, also referred to as Gaithersburg. And the plan was for Patrick to fly them up to White Plains, New York to help his girlfriend's son buy a condo, and then they would fly back to Gaithersburg that afternoon. The aircraft that Patrick was flying was a 1977 Mooney M20J. This is a high-performance, 4-seat, low-wing aircraft known for its speed and fuel efficiency. The aircraft had a recent annual inspection, and the NTSB eventually determined that there was nothing wrong with the aircraft or the instruments that would have contributed to the crash. That being said, the aircraft was equipped with an IFR-certified Garmin 430 GPS, which gave Patrick the ability to select his destination airport and the desired approach procedure, which would provide him all of the approach waypoints automatically. But that's something we're going to talk more about later. For right now, Patrick left Gaithersburg around 8:40 a.m. local time, and he landed in White Plains around 10 a.m. And it looked like he might have been using the autopilot for the cruise portion of the flight, and everything seemed to be going fine. After spending several hours on the ground, Patrick and his girlfriend got ready to make the trip back home, and the NTSB said that he called to get a weather briefing for the flight, but they forgot to include the details from that in the investigation docket, so it's not clear what he was told about the weather at his destination. All we know for certain is that later on, when it was about 20 minutes prior to his departure, the National Weather Service issued an area forecast that was predicting IFR to sub-IFR conditions for the region, including the possibility of fog. Either way, Patrick filed an IFR flight plan so he could legally fly through the weather, and he took off around 3 p.m. However, because he had a strong tailwind on his trip to White Plains, the headwind on the way back meant that the flight to Gaithersburg was going to take almost twice as long, or about 2.5 hours. And that gave Patrick plenty of time to review the weather and prepare for the approach. Before we keep going, I want to thank AG1 for sponsoring today's video. You see, the thing is, as a pilot, I'm always on the go, and that means it can get pretty busy between flying and making videos, and that's why I like AG1. Now, if you've never heard of it, AG1 is a health drink that combines vitamins, minerals, probiotics, and superfoods all in one scoop. And I started using it because I wanted something that would support my energy levels and fill any nutrient gaps in my day. But what's great is that they also have these 8-ounce travel packs that are perfect for whenever I'm on the road for a few days. It's super easy. Just use one of the travel packs or one scoop of AG1 Next Gen, 8 to 12 ounces of cold water, shake it up, and I'm good to go. Plus, it's NSF certified for sport, which means that it meets really high standards for quality and safety, which is something that's always been important to me as a pilot who cares about performance. But what I like most is that it keeps things simple. Whether I'm at home or on the road, AG1 helps me feel consistent, focused, and ready for the day. If you're ready to start your day with something that actually sets you up to feel your best, just scan the QR code on the screen or use the link in the video description to get a free welcome kit that includes a bottle of vitamin D and free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. Thanks again to AG1 for supporting the channel, and now let's get back to the video. According to the investigation, about an hour prior to the crash, when Patrick was almost halfway there, the automated weather observation at Gaithersburg was reporting light winds with 1¼ mile visibility and an overcast ceiling at 200 feet with mist. The NTSB didn't mention when Patrick first learned about the deteriorating weather conditions or how he was keeping track of the weather during the flight, but my guess is that it was a lot worse than what he was expecting. In fact, the weather was still pretty much the same about a half hour later when he was starting to get ready to fly the approach, and he was initially told to expect the RNAV GPS Alpha approach. However, Patrick requested the RNAV GPS approach to runway 14 because he said the weather was below the minimums required for the GPS Alpha procedure. That meant Patrick knew what the current weather observation was, otherwise he wouldn't have said the weather was below the minimums for the GPS Alpha approach. Now, for what it's worth, here's a copy of both approach procedures. The GPS Alpha is a circling procedure that brings you in from the northeast about 90 degrees out to the runway, and the minimums for that are 1,080 feet MSL, which is about 540 feet above the ground. Alternatively, the RNAV GPS to runway 14 is a straight-in approach, with the lowest minimums being the LPV with a decision altitude of 789 feet MSL, which is about 270 feet above the ground. And because the weather was overcast at 200 feet, that was also below the minimums for this approach. However, it's important to understand that because this was a Part 91 flight, the FAA allows pilots to try the approach to see if they can get below the weather. But you can't fly lower than the minimum descent altitude or decision height unless you have the runway environment in sight and you're in a safe position to land. That being said, based on how bad the weather was, this isn't something that I would recommend trying unless you have a lot of experience flying in instrument conditions down to the minimums. And even then, I'd want a second pilot to back me up. I mean, honestly, unless you've got a really good reason to do it, the safer decision would be to just divert, but Patrick didn't do that. Instead, the controller cleared him to fly direct to the Bedka fix on the approach, which was basically out in front of him, but instead he turned about 100 degrees to the right, and then this happened.
1 Romeo Fox, I'm showing you made a northwestbound turn. You can turn left turn heading 240, enable direct to Bedka.
This was the first clue that something was wrong, and in full transparency, I only have part of the audio for this incident and you can't hear Patrick's responses, but eventually he started turning back to the left, and then the controller cleared him direct to Rouen to join the approach. Just for reference, here's Rouen, and if you remember from earlier, Patrick had a Garmin 430 GPS, so all he needed to do was select the approach and it would automatically populate all of the approach waypoints for him, but something was wrong, and the controller tried to get him to go direct to Bedka again and listen to what he said.
1 Romeo Fox, you're going to Gaithersburg, correct? Golf Alpha India? Or 1 Romeo Fox, you might have it spelled incorrectly. Bedka for me for 201 Romeo Fox, heading 230 would put you right direct Bedka. That's Bravo Echo Golf Kilo Alpha, BEGKA.
When the NTSB interviewed Patrick after the crash, he said the reason why he made a significant diversion from his course was because he misprogrammed his GPS. However, he couldn't articulate the features of the GPS, and when asked if the GPS had transitioned to approach mode, he didn't appear to really understand the question. Now, for what it's worth, in my opinion, if you don't know how to use your GPS, there's no reason you should be filing an IFR flight plan to fly in the weather to an airfield that only has GPS approaches. And if you're having this much trouble navigating to one of the fixes on the approach, then you might want to think twice about trying to fly the approach down to the minimums. Patrick went on to say that in a lot of situations, he would use his handheld VFR-only GPS to avoid the complex keystrokes needed to operate the panel-mounted GPS. Photos provided by the pilot to the media showed him flying the airplane with a yoke-mounted iPad. Now, just to be fair and give you all the facts, the VFR-only GPS that Patrick was referring to wasn't his iPad. You see, he had an iFly 740 GPS device, which provides you with a moving map display as well as approach charts, but it's not certified to be used to fly instrument approaches. I also want to point out that you can see the sun setting in this footage, and the NTSB didn't really talk about this, but sunset in Gaithersburg that day was at 4:48 p.m. local time, and it was just after 5 p.m. when Patrick was getting ready for the approach, and the crash didn't happen until around 5:30, so he was flying the approach at night. Also not mentioned in the NTSB final report was that during a post-accident interview, Patrick said the aircraft had an autopilot, but he never flew an approach on the autopilot because the autopilot wasn't capable of flying a couple glide slope, and that he found the control movements from the autopilot difficult to deal with. The reason I'm bringing this up is because even though he might not have been able to use the autopilot for the final segment of the approach, if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, flying single pilot in the weather at night, the autopilot is your friend, and anything you can do to reduce your workload is going to help you stay safe. Unfortunately, when it comes to Patrick, we haven't even gotten to the worst part of the story. As you can see from the ADSB data, Patrick ended up making a series of turns based on the corrections provided by the controller, and while that was going on, another aircraft on approach to Gaithersburg told the controller that they were going missed approach and needed to divert because the visibility was below minimums. That should have been a huge red flag for Patrick, and I'd argue that what you're seeing is a classic example of get-home-itis, also referred to as plan continuation bias. And this is something I talked about recently on my other YouTube channel when I went flying with one of my fans and we had to deal with some thunderstorms that were closing in on us. In that video, the controller was warning us about the weather, and we thought about trying to find a way around it, but I didn't feel comfortable and there was no reason to try, so we made the safe decision to divert. However, in Patrick's case, he knew the weather was below minimums, he was struggling to even begin the approach, and the aircraft in front of him just went missed approach. So he's got all these warning signs, and I think he never made the decision to divert because he was so focused on getting home. But what's crazy to me is that after the crash, the media asked him why he didn't divert, and listen to what he said.
The possibility of diverting the flight to another airport always exists. It's extremely inconvenient to everybody on the ground, and of course, after you've been in the air for 3 hours, the last thing you want to do.
All right, let me be perfectly clear about something. Diverting is not inconvenient to everybody on the ground. Trust me, everyone would rather see you divert than die. And honestly, who cares what the people on the ground think? If you need to divert, just do it. And if I'm being honest here, I think most of you would agree that the only people that are inconvenienced when you divert are the pilot and the passengers. But that doesn't really matter if it means you get to live. Okay, going back to the story, Patrick was told to cross Bedka at or above 3,000 feet, and he was cleared for the approach. However, according to the data available, he ended up crossing Bedka at 2,775 feet, and for reference, the dark black line represents the standard 3-degree glide path angle down to the runway. To make matters worse, when Patrick crossed Bedka and began his descent, he admitted that he wasn't receiving any vertical guidance on his GPS. Now, it's not clear if his Garmin 430 GPS was set up correctly or not, but either way, the reason why this matters is because the RNAV GPS approach to runway 14 has 3 different sets of minimums. The LPV is the most precise, and it stands for localizer performance with vertical guidance, and that's what Patrick needed to fly to get as low as possible on the approach. The LNAV/VNAV has a lateral and vertical guidance component to it, but it's not as accurate as the LPV, and the LNAV minimums are what you use if you don't have vertical guidance. And that means Patrick couldn't go lower than 980 feet MSL, or about 460 feet above the ground. So when he started the approach, he should have adjusted his minimums, but according to Patrick, what he did was he set an alarm to sound when he descended to 800 feet on the approach, which was basically the LPV decision altitude. As he continued the approach, he was supposed to cross Tim Bay, the final approach fix at or above 2,200 feet, but instead he crossed it at 1,500 feet, and he continued to stay well below the path for the LPV approach, and when the approach controller saw this on radar, he made a radio call issuing him a low altitude alert.
Number 201 Romeo Fox, if you hear this transmission, low altitude alert, altimeter altimeter is 2944. The lowest fuel altitude here is 3,500 if you're not on the approach.
Patrick leveled off for a brief second and then he continued the descent. And when he was passing through 1,200 feet, he saw the ground below him. And that's when he said he started focusing on keeping contact with the ground through the side window, probably just trying to rely on his familiarity with the area to fly the rest of the way. He crossed the next waypoint at an altitude of 750 feet MSL, which was about 500 feet low, and he was already 40 feet below the decision altitude of the LPV approach. And by the way, he didn't remember hearing the alarm go off that he had set for 800 feet. Regardless, since he didn't have the runway in sight, he should have performed an immediate go-around and flown the missed approach procedure, but instead he continued descending until a little over a mile from the end of the runway, he crashed into a set of power lines and became trapped, but that's not the end of the story.
I've flown into a tower to the northwest of Gaithersburg Airport, and believe it or not, the aircraft is pinned in the tower. And I don't know how long we're going to be able to stay here. I'm very concerned about my passenger. She was hurt. We get some wind going. We're gone-ish.
Just keep as still as you can. They're working on getting up to you guys.
It took first responders almost 7 hours and 5 miracles to rescue them. The first miracle was that the plane didn't blow up when it hit the power lines. The second miracle was the way the aircraft wedged between the power lines, somehow avoiding them being electrocuted. The third miracle was that the tower had a Verizon service pole running up the middle of it that helped absorb the impact of the crash, otherwise the tower probably would have collapsed. The fourth miracle was that the plane never fell despite the gusty winds in the area, and the fifth miracle was that Patrick and his girlfriend both survived. The NTSB final report said the probable cause was the pilot flew below published altitude minimums, which resulted in a collision with the power line tower, but what you didn't see was the document where the aviation safety inspector said he doesn't know the Garmin well at all, he didn't try to correctly fly the approach or even properly fly IFR after confusion, knowingly deviated from correct procedure. If he had gotten spatial disorientation earlier in the flight, he would have put many more citizens at risk. And I couldn't agree more with that last sentence, because if you consider the residential areas around the airport, the mistakes that he made could have easily led to a much more tragic outcome. Either way, I hope this debrief has provided you some clarity over how something like this could happen and the lessons we can learn from it. And by the way, in case you're wondering, Patrick was asked if he will ever get in the cockpit again, and his response was,
well, I still own a Cessna.
Thank you so much for watching, and thanks for your support. Be sure to check out this other video on the screen, and I'll see you on the next pilot debrief.